All right. Good evening, Energy Rogue Nation. Welcome back. Thank you so much for tuning in. As I mentioned this morning and last night, I promised you guys that I'd be doing another forecast discussion that's very much in depth. I don't know how long this video is going to go. We're going to go as long as we need to cover as much as we can. I will say, though, that a lot of the details we talked about in last night's video are still relevant today, regardless of the changes that we'll talk about. So if you want more of an extensive discussion beyond what we'll talk about tonight, just scroll on up on the Weather Rogue Discord page and you'll find the other video, which talks about pretty much everything from the tornado threat to the flooding threat to the storm surge and straight line winds. We really go into all that. We'll, of course, update you tonight on those hazards, but again, we'll see how long we go in this video. I don't really have a number in mind. We're going to just pretty much wing it at this point because this calls for it. This is just unbelievable. I'm kind of in a state of shock right now with what we're even observing tonight. We'll talk more on that later. But before I got on tonight, I promised myself, look, I was thinking, how am I going to do this video tonight? What do I say? And you guys know me. You know, I'm usually somebody with a lot of words. I usually come prepared. There's not really a lot of filler words like ums and likes and trying to figure out what the hell I'm going to say. A lot of it is pretty much just etched in stone when I do these things, especially when we talk about winter weather and cooling and heating degree days. I mean, you know, it's pretty much just elementary at this point for me to talk about, and I can usually carry a conversation. It's if you and I are having a conversation one-on-one, viewer to presenter. But for some reason, I, once again, just like last night, I've struggled with how I'm going to present this. I don't know how. I will just do the best that I can. And, you know, I last night in the video, I think I made pretty clear just how bad this was going to be, how shocked I was, how upset I was, and how concerned, almost to the point where I'm getting choked up over it. So tonight, what I'm going to do is, on my own accord, just give you the facts. Give you the expectations. What we are anticipating with this storm once it makes landfall Wednesday night and Thursday. And I'll leave it at that. But I'm not going to do that until I read you this. I'm going to give you the emotional part out of the way, and then we'll get right to the facts and the analysis. This is from the National Weather Service in Tampa Bay, Florida. For those of you that are not from the United States, or just may not be aware of this, every single sub-region in these individual states we call the United States has their own National Weather Service. It is a federally funded entity. They are the ones that are responsible for issuing things like hurricane warnings, severe thunderstorm warnings, winter storm warnings. The buck stops with them when it comes to forecasting. And so these forecast offices put together these discussions. And typically, I don't show these on our conversations or on our videos because, quite frankly, they're very technical in nature. Usually, these forecast discussions can be anywhere between 3 to 5 paragraphs long. And for the first time in a very long time, this is only a paragraph. That says a lot, because usually us meteorologists love to say a lot. And you guys know me enough by now to realize that. But this is only a paragraph, and I want to read this to you guys to underscore and summarize what Milton will truly be once this is all said and done. Major Hurricane Milton is still a strong Category 4 hurricane with winds up to 155 miles per hour. Milton will grow in size as it heads towards the west coast of Florida as a disastrous hurricane. The only major change over the last 24 hours is the system has slowed down, making landfall in west central Florida Wednesday night. However, Milton is still expected to be a major Category 3 hurricane at landfall with destructive damage expected late Wednesday into early Thursday morning. Storm surge along and south of the track will be life-threatening and catastrophic. If you are asked to evacuate, you need to do so now. The high winds will also cause widespread major damage as the eyewall tracks through the state. If you are outside of the storm surge area and decide to stay, you need to have supplies to last for a week or more without power or water. Bottom line, if Milton stays on its course, this will be the most powerful hurricane to hit Tampa Bay in over 100 years. No one in the area has ever experienced a hurricane this strong before in their lifetimes. They meant to say lifetimes here, but they said area twice. No one in the area has ever experienced a hurricane this strong before in their lifetimes. What else can you say to that? It speaks for itself. So I'll just say this one time. There's two things that you should take away from tonight's discussion. Number one, if you know anybody in Clearwater, Pinellas County, Greater Tampa Bay, St. Pete, and they are not evacuating, you are playing a game of Russian roulette. And if I were them, I do not want to take that chance. You're going to see tonight that it's not just the straight line winds and the storm surge. First thing you got to worry about is the tornado threat. We'll talk about that. And the flooding, aside from the storm surge. Just rainfall itself. You are truly taking a gamble with your life if you're staying behind. That's the best way that I could put it. That's number one. Number two, for those of you folks that maybe don't have family members and just simply have vested interest in this area that we call Tampa St. Pete, if you're analyzing this from a nat gas and an LNG point of view, this is not hyperbole. At this point, it's almost a virtual certainty that this will be a catastrophe for West Central Florida. This will affect a lot of industries. To what degree remains to be seen. I think in the markets you're already seeing that somewhat play out right now. But I know from the forecasting point of view, that's the last thing I'm thinking about right now. But since this is a energy platform, right, that covers nat gas energy, it goes without saying, but just to mention, there will likely be pretty significant implications with that. To what degree, I don't know. I would highly suggest you turn it over to Brian and Bill for the latest on that. But from the weather point of view, this will certainly cause some pretty catastrophic disruptions to the way of life in Tampa. And if it's not directly Tampa, it is going to be the greater West Central Florida area. But at this point, I think that's certainly in the cards. So, all that aside, let's get to the facts of what's happening with Hurricane Milton. As we mentioned in the discussion, that forecast discussion I read was as of about 2 o'clock Eastern, so 1 o'clock Central. It is now 6 p.m. Central Time, 7 Eastern. And this storm is now back up to a Category 5. So I'm going to write on the side here as you take a look at this loop what happened last night to catch us all up to speed. So if you recall from last night, Milton was at a Category 5, and its pressure was around 897 at the max, right? This storm then later on this afternoon weakened down to, call it, I think, a Category 4. We'll just be conservative and say Cat 4 and about a 920 millibar. And actually, I think it was a Cat 4. Cat 4, 920 millibars this afternoon. Now, Milton has re-strengthened back to a Cat 5, and the pressure is down to a 904. You heard it right. This thing started out as a Category 4, or excuse me, it was a Category 5 last night, as of the time of the video that we put out. Right? So it's Category 5. Make this a little bigger here. So Category 5, 897 millibars, winds of over 170 knots. Then, within this period, so in between, say, like 9 p.m. and 9 a.m., it went through an eye wall replacement cycle. So as we talked about last night, eye wall replacement cycle means that once your eye gets so small, eventually it's going to collapse. It cannot sustain itself. Eventually the winds become so tight around the center that eventually the eye wall collapses. And as it does so, you get a lot of convergence in the center of the system with all those convective thunderstorms that eventually you get another eye to form. So we saw that happen, right? This is the new eye wall right now as it continues to move off towards the east-northeast away from the Yucatan. What is now happening that I don't think I was even expecting is that typically with an eye wall replacement cycle, usually you get a weakening phase to happen. You don't see it rapidly intensify again. And that's pretty typical. But for the first time in recent memory, we not only had an eye wall replacement cycle, but it actually managed to re-strengthen back to a Cat 5. To see that happen, that process that I outlined, is incredibly rare. And from an analog point of view, for a lack of a better term, it's pretty much off the charts. You just don't see something like that. So it's pretty incredible what's happening tonight. It is now strengthened back to a Category 5 with millibar pressure of about, central pressure of a 904. So we're talking about winds definitely well over sustained 160 knots. And for my European friends, you know how strong that is. That's incredibly strong. For my American friends, translate that. That's at least, I believe, within the 170 mile per hour range at least. Right? And we'll assume that this is 155 knots. So it's very strong. I mean, that's sustained winds. So this storm, once again, is rather unique. It is showing its strength, its pure power right now, as it now is beginning to move off towards the northeast. You see that wobble a bit. But still, while the eye is a little bit larger, it's still strengthening. And very much intense, as you can see, by visible IR. Now, if we were to look at the recon missions, here's the latest that we're talking about. This is the NOAA 2 mission through Milton. And we also have the Air Force 303. And very similar thing, right? So Air Force measured at lowest pressure a 906. And then NOAA measured a 904 right within that time frame. So interestingly enough, here on the dropsonde, you essentially have the arena effect going on. And what that means is you have a ton of dry air that's making its way through the top of the eye, but then it's saturated down closer to the surface. So it's a concept that I've talked about very briefly, the arena effect. I don't think I've talked about it as much, but this is a very mature eye. And there could be, I mean, essentially how we know that is because this dry air, while it's seeping in, it's not intruding in the low levels. So it can be dry up here all at once, but essentially it's taken on a life of its own, right? This dry air is trying to impede into the eye, and it's basically not able to penetrate through sort of the low levels, which would be 900. So if you recall, our green line here is our 2-point red is temperature. Imagine the dropsonde being dropped down. So it's dropped from this point, right? And so your dropsonde is falling through the layers of the storm. And notice how it's not, we have a bunch of dry air initially, but then we are pretty much saturated at the center. So that certainly tells me we have a very mature eye. We're not seeing much intrusion there, as we talked about. And here's the other thing. Look at the temperature. 27 degrees Celsius. 27 degrees Celsius. Just to put that in perspective, the sea surface temperatures are 29 degrees Celsius. This is literally just a latent heat machine. It is just releasing heat. It's a big stovepipe. Almost 27 degrees Celsius. It's only 2 degrees cooler than the actual sea surface environment. That's not something you see every day either. So, yeah, all signs point to a very destructive storm right now at the moment, just based on observations. You can even see that on the cross sections that NOAA has done. Remember, we talked about last night, these aircraft, if we were to follow its trajectory, right, it's going to cut through the storm in the southwest, it's going to take an east turn, and then slice again. So it does 2 slice throughs. And you'd be amazed. These aircrafts, this is military-grade aircraft, they can withstand some pretty severe winds. And there's a video that I will link in the Discord channel of them flying through it. And they were actually experiencing severe turbulence. So imagine that, right? Severe turbulence on a behemoth of a reconnaissance aircraft. That should tell you how dangerous this storm is. I mean, good luck flying a Cessna through that. You probably wouldn't even get to the center before you just completely flip, right? And you stall. So, incredible stuff from what we've observed. And one last look here. Here is the time series of that. And every single little drop you see is essentially them slicing through in 2 dimensions. So over to the left, you see your sea level pressure in millibars. This is also your time steps. So this goes increments of about 20 minutes, right? And so you can tell they did 2 slice throughs of the center, because notice how your sea level pressure drops, increases, drops, increases. So they measured a pressure, it looks like, in this case, yeah, again, and I think I just showed it just now, but it's about 904 to about 906 millibars. So pretty intense. But look at the temperature, guys. Those peaks right near the center. See your temperature too? Look how it spikes. Gosh, 26 degrees Celsius. Right? And then here, a little bit cooler, but still, I say that lightly, that's still 25 degrees Celsius. Regardless, that's still really damn warm in the center. So just some incredible observations we've gotten tonight. And observations that, like I said, I didn't anticipate happening. I really thought that we'd be having a conversation about a storm that's, maybe like in the 930 millibar. And right now, that's certainly not the case. We are at a 904. Very strong. Now, let's take a look at the forecast models, and let me just also give you a forewarning, as I did last night. These models, as you can see, in some cases, are a little bit behind. Now, the H-Wharf is actually right on par once again. This has been a model that hasn't been far off based on the observed. It's actually corrected quite nicely. So let's look here. It's rendering as we speak. Here is the H-Wharf. Takes it up to about a 911 millibar storm by pretty much the next 20 minutes. We'll see if that happens. Nonetheless, still a 925, 933, 949, 954 once it makes landfall. It actually has it weakening substantially once it gets up to Tampa. But granted, that's still a 954, right? We're still talking about a major hurricane here with the H-Wharf, right? So nonetheless, this is still going to be a strong storm. By the way, I also mentioned the tornado threat. All these individual cells here, as we talked about last night, supercells. So if you're living in Tampa, St. Pete, your initial threat is not going to be the landfall itself. It's going to be these storms moving onshore and potentially producing significant tornadoes. A lot of people sleep on the tornado threat with these storms. Got to be careful with this one especially, because you got a lot of shear it's working with. We talked about it last night. We even took a look here. I'll show you now at the photograph. So we take a slice of this here, and as we talked about, your winds are veering with height. When you see that and you have a lot of saturation, that immediately is a telltale sign of a favorable tornado environment. Clearly by what we see with our veering winds and also what's depicted on this photograph, right? So pretty clear sign there. Okay, so that's the initial thing that I want to mention. I mean, I won't get into the granular any more than what we already have. I mean, I think the photographs themselves I think they speak for themselves in that the tornado threat is really going to be initially within this area, so much of west central Florida, by the time we get to late Wednesday night into early Thursday morning. That is before landfall. I mean, we're really even talking about, 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern. I think we're in daylight time now, I hope. Eastern daylight time for west central Florida. So initial threat's going to be tornadoes, some of which could be strong, before we eventually do see the landfall of this system eventually make its way up towards Tampa St. Pete by what would be morning commute Thursday. Right around morning. Well, we'll call it about 4 to 6 a.m. So if we look, though, once again at the winds, and I think that's really the main point to drive here. We've been talking about this storm being as strong as it has been. Again, right now it's even actually running, I would say, a little bit weaker than OBS because this is a 911 and right now we saw it as a 904. So the models are still running about close to 10 millibars behind. But as we'll see, the HWRF is the only one that's closest to reality right now. But as we talked about last night, notice how with the figure skater effect, all of your winds, the tightest corridor of wind gradient is closer to the center because your center is small. Well, as your storm moves further north in latitude, look at your latitude here, right, 23 degrees north. Watch what happens that moves north. Your wind field expands because you have to factor two things. Number one, as your eye wall expands, your wind field will automatically become wider. But not just that, as the storm moves north, you then have to factor in something called Coriolis force. I won't get into granular with that, but Coriolis force is the deflection of winds with northerly and southerly latitude. The furthest you go away from the equator, the more deflecting winds you have, thus the Coriolis force, right? And so a lot of that can be neglected when you're at the equator and when you're exactly at the poles. But the closer you get to the poles, the wider the wind field. A great example of that is Superstorm Sandy that we saw in the Northeast back in the 2010s. Same thing. Storm moved north. It wasn't necessarily the fact that the winds were Category 4 or Category 3 strength. It's the fact that the wind field was so large because it had moved so far north and maintained its strength. That's the crux of the whole thing with Superstorm Sandy. That's what caused so much destruction in such a large area because of how wide the wind field was. In this case, yes, you have a 953. Yes, we're not talking Category 5, but my God, look at this wind field. Look how large that is. Now you're talking about it expanding well inland beyond the bay and beyond, Pinellas County. That's really dangerous. So that's something that I want you to keep in mind. Again, don't be so focused on, okay, well, is it going to be a Cat 3 or is it going to be a Cat 4? Right? Ask yourself this. Does it really make a difference between 110 to 130 miles an hour? Both is pretty lethal. In that case, I think it's just, pinch and salt. It really doesn't make a difference. But what does make a difference is that as the storm moves north, your wind field expands with an expanding eye wall because when storms move north, that Coriolis force increases, and so it's going to increase the wind field of your low pressure. Now, if we compare this to some of the other hurricane models, the HAFS A, for example, has it as a 967, but keep in mind, if we go back and rewind to now, 7 p.m., right, it has this storm as a 928. It's not a 928, guys. Like I said, it's a 904. So this model is about 24 millibars off. So that's important because more than likely this model is garbage. It's not going to be a 967. I hate to tell you. Highly unlikely at this point. It's going to still be somewhere between, I would argue, I'll even say a 935 to a 950 plus. I know I kind of widened my range a bit from last night, but at this point, considering that this hurricane has really taken a life of its own, there's a bit of uncertainty on whether or not we see something higher than a Category 3. Will we see a Category 3 at this point? It's almost a virtual certainty, considering the overall environment. But The most disturbing thing is that we're not having a discussion about whether or not this is a major. We're having a discussion about how bad this is going to be. You know, are we going to have worse than a 3? I mean, hell, a Category 3 is still really bad, and we're having conversations about if it's going to be worse than that. So that pretty much says a lot. So there's the half say. Again, that's a model that we can just toss because it's clearly not keeping up with the observed. We could take a look at another one, for example, here and keep the conversation going. This halves B has it as a 9:53 at landfall, but if we take this here to about 7 o'clock tonight, this model, as of the 18Z run, has it as a 9:42. So this one is about close to 40 millibars off. So almost virtually every single model except for the HWRF is on par right now. We can look at the HWRF parent, and the HWRF parent has it as a 944, right? Granted, this is also still off. So the only model that's keeping up is the HWRF. That's it. None of these solutions are. They do not have a good handle on this thing whatsoever, because if we look here at 7 o'clock, here's another one. Here's your halves B. The other variant of halves A, 942, 40 millibars off. Call it 40 millibars. It's pretty much the same thing. So once again, I can't stress enough, it's the important thing as a meteorologist we're always taught to do. It's so easy for us to jump into the weather models. Social media loves it. Television loves it. But you just can't. You have to look at what's being observed right now. We do these reconnaissance missions for a reason. We put these Air Force pilots into the thick of it for a reason. We don't just do it for fun. We do it because observed data trumps model data every single time, and it also is fed back into these models to hopefully correct. But right now we're not even seeing much of that, except for the model we talked about. Here is the latest track. You see that it really has not budged. We have hurricane warnings up all along the west central coast of Florida, and that even extends out the other side for east central Florida as well. So if you are in east central Florida too, this thing's still going to be a hurricane, right? Even as it moves on land. It's not going to weaken right away, and then eventually does move out to shore into Bermuda by the time we get to the weekend. So major hurricane landfall is almost certainly a virtual certainty, as I've said. That's kind of the key word tonight. That is the drinking game phrase for those that can drink, but I would highly recommend not to for the sake of our sanity tonight, and it's only Tuesday night. So, all jokes aside, track has not changed. We can also look at this from the model point of view. Has not changed either. Granted, it has it a little bit further south, but not by much. Again, that's something we were anticipating. Not much movement, and even if we look at the GEFS tracks, I mean, there really is not much budging at all with this system. Yes, a little bit further south, but we're not talking a large shift. We weren't even having that conversation a few to several days ago. We anticipated that the storm was going to move in some way, shape, or form an eastward trajectory, although this thing has moved a little bit more south towards the Yucatan, which makes it a little bit more of a kind of sling as opposed to a straight across west to east. Last thing we'll look at here tonight is the intensity guidance. This is, once again, pretty broken. I mean, a lot of these solutions, I would make the argument, are not having good handle on this whatsoever. Some of these too are not having a good handle. It's only coming down to maybe a couple, and those few are keeping it between like a Cat 3 to a 4. And I haven't even looked at these solutions, so I mean, I should probably not even say that. I mean, this whole thing really is kind of crap. I mean, none of this is really keeping up, and so we also have to apply that thinking to this too. Well, if our models are not having a good grip on it, then this data is garbage. In a world of data, right? I always talk about data. I live in a world of AI machine learning. I code a lot nowadays. This is such a wonderful lesson in the grand scheme of data. Garbage in, garbage out. You are only as good as your data. You know, we can draw all these correlations. We can, have all these charts. We could have WX Rogue and have all this for you at your disposal. But guess what? If there's bad data going into those models, it's worthless. It's worthless. It has no relevancy, no meaning to you, right? That's why, for example, not to plug WeatherRogue, but as we were developing that product, one of the things that we have to do and why it does take a little while is you have to do testing. You have to do R&D. Does the numbers make sense? I mean, we can put out cooling degree days, right? But if we're forecasting 100 cooling degree days for the Northeast or 100 heating degree days for the desert Southwest, that doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, it's just garbage. You're not going to do anything with that. And the same thing is here. Exactly that, especially with tropical weather. Same exact thing applies. We have all of this. Yeah, I could sit here and tell you this is going to be a Cat 4 because 4 models said so. But based on what we established, I wouldn't be forecasting in good faith. I really wouldn't, And so that's why I have now on the fly made the executive decision just to totally toss this and say that I think at the moment the general range is going to be a landfall between a Cat 3 and a Cat 4. I do not think this will make landfall as a Cat 5. I really don't think so. I put a very low probability of that. This thing does have to weaken as it moves north. It is going to interact with some shear. So the Cat 5 at this point is highly unlikely. But a Cat 3, certainly in the cards, very much a certainty. With a Cat 4 possible. You cannot rule it out at this point. It's in the cards. It's definitely in the cards. So, one last thing before I do end tonight's video. I did want to update one thing from last night. There was another change that I wanted to highlight, and then I will call it a night. So we talked briefly about the flooding threat. And last night, if you were watching the video, we had a moderate risk for flooding for Central Florida. That is now a high risk. And so I won't go into the model output on this because, again, a lot of our models are kind of crap. But the one thing that I think they're consistent on is the rainfall. But we are expecting anywhere between 10 to 12 inches of rain along pretty much Central Florida and even upwards of 8 to 12 inches near Orlando. It's nearly half a foot for Jacksonville. So it's a very large swath of flooding. This discussion, by the way, from the Weather Prediction Center does also talk about the fact that we'll have dry air entrainment from the southwest quadrant and essential aspect of the extratropical. That is not what I expected for them to talk about. So let me skip that part. I thought that was going in a whole different direction. The ERO risk categories drop off a bit slower on the south side since the predecessor rainfall event of the past couple of days, and today was largely focused on South Florida. Okay, so that's talking about the South Florida system out ahead of it. But you get the point, right? I mean, we're talking about nearly a foot of rain for a large swath of Central Florida. I don't think we're going to see as much rainfall as we saw in the Carolinas. And a lot of that's because we don't have mountains in Central Florida. We're not seeing rainfall getting sort of quasi-stationary over one spot like we did in the Carolinas, where it pretty much just get lodged between the Appalachians. Not what we're seeing this time. We don't really have any, wedging taking place with our precip, if you will. Instead, this is just going to be convective showers and thunderstorms that move in and pretty much train over the same area as the storm picks up speed. So it's going to drop a lot of rain in a very short period of time. So flooding threat, the only change from last night, we went from a moderate risk, and the Weather Prediction Center has now upped it to a high. I am not surprised by that in the slightest. I was actually expecting that, but I wanted to make sure that I brought that to your attention, as that is the one thing that's changed in the latest with this forecast, other than the fact that this thing is now back to a Cat 5. Other than that, the forecast from last night pretty much is remaining intact and is still relevant today. So listen, thank you all so much for tuning in tonight. Also, thank you so much for your patience on WX Rogue. We are still working through that. Again, it's our first iteration. Speaking of testing the models, exactly what I'm working on right now is trying to make sure that the output makes sense for some of the other models we want to introduce. So bear with us. It's a work in progress. It is still free at your disposal. Use it. It is a very useful tool as we head into the winter season. Completely free. Not trying to sell you a quick buck on this thing. It is free for the time being for the free product. We also have a premium product that will eventually be a subscription based. So what I mean free, I'm saying it is free for now. Some of the products will remain free forever, but there's others that will not. So take advantage of it. Use it while you can. Give us some feedback. Fill out that form in the Discord. And as far as this storm, this is my main focus. And my hope is that tropical season dies down, because I really hate seeing this catastrophes happening. I don't think anybody likes it. So our thoughts and prayers are with those in Tampa and West Central Florida. The game plan is to have one more update tomorrow morning. It will be a voice message. I'm sorry. It's just I'm at a time constraint at the moment in the morning. But as I have been doing both tonight and last night, I will have one last discussion on Hurricane Milton, as it is then expected to make landfall by the time we make the video tomorrow night, if not Thursday morning. Thank you so much, and have a great night.